Do we need to smile?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this roundtable discussion on documentation. I'm Milena Stereo, Managing Director at the Public International Law and Policy Group, and Charles R. Embrich Jr., Calfee, Halter, and Griswold Professor of Law at Cleveland State University's Cleveland Marshall College of Law. I will moderate today's roundtable. The Public International Law and Policy Group is a global pro bono law firm providing free legal assistance to parties involved in peace negotiations, drafting post-conflict constitutions, war crime prosecution, transitional justice, and human rights documentation. In today's event, we will discuss human rights documentation from the perspective of the frontline investigators. PILPG has been extensively involved with various documentation projects, such as the 2018's landmark report on documenting atrocity crimes committed against the Rohingya in Myanmar's Rakhine State, as well as several other country-based documentation projects. PILPG has also published 2 wide-ranging needs assessment reports for human rights documenters, transitional justice actors, and tool developers, a field guide for civil society documentation of serious human rights violations, and human rights documentation by civil society, technological needs, challenges, and workflows, as well as a handbook on civil society documentation of serious human rights violations. PILPG, in consortium with 10 other organizations and supported by the US Department of State's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, also developed a human rights documentation toolkit, an online portal providing human rights documenters with documentation resources and tools, accepted practices, and ongoing support from other documentation stakeholders. This event is part of the PILPG Thought Leadership Initiative. The initiative focuses on prominent international law and international affairs topics and organizes monthly expert roundtables to share expertise and reflections from our work on peace negotiations, post-conflict constitution drafting, and war crimes prosecution. The roundtable will be 60 minutes long, and I promise you we will end on time, promptly at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. And our esteemed panelists include Professor Jae-Chan Won, Kyle Wood, Pratima T. Narayan, Sadia Aleem, Larissa Wakim, Stephanie Monroe-Courtney, and Camille McDormand, all human rights documentation experts with extensive experience in conducting investigations and documenting human rights violations. They all also contributed to the PILPG documentation mission in the Rohingya refugee settlement in Bangladesh in 2018. Today's event will be recorded and subsequently posted on our website. We ask that you please submit all your questions using the Q&A function and not the chat function. Now, please allow me to introduce our 6 experts who will tell you about their experiences with conducting documentation missions. First, we're delighted to welcome Jae-Chan Won, who's the director of the Handong International Law Center. Formerly, he was the Director General for Human Rights Policy for the National Human Rights Commission of Korea and the founding director of Handong Institute for Peace and Reconciliation. Also joining us today is Stephanie Monroe-Courtney, the logistics coordinator for the PILPG Rohingya project. In addition, here with us is Kyle Wood, who is an Assistant Attorney General in the Washington State Attorney General's office. He previously spent a decade working with the Office of the Prosecutor for the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia. We're also joined by Pratima Narayan, a Senior Program Manager with the Global Initiative for Justice, Truth, and Reconciliation, and co-chair of the Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security Human Rights Working Group. She was previously the Chief of Investigations at the United Nations Commission on Human Rights in South Sudan, as well as a human rights professional with UN peacekeeping forces in Mali, among other human rights expert positions that she has held at the UN. We're also joined by Sadia Aleem, who's working as the South Sudan Protection Cluster Analysis and Monitoring Advisor, where she provides regular analysis on emerging concerns affecting the protection of civilians. Next, we're joined by Larissa Wakim, member of New Zealand's Immigration and Protection Tribunal and a former investigator and deputy team leader for the Office of the Prosecutor at the International Criminal Court. And last but certainly not least, we welcome Camille McDormand, who is an attorney for the Native American unit of the Northwest Justice Project. Prior to her legal career, she managed education programs in Rakhine State, Yangon, and on the Thai-Myanmar border. Welcome everyone, and thank you for agreeing to participate in today's panel, and especially thank you to those of you for whom it is 2 or 3 in the morning. We truly appreciate your willingness to participate. Without further ado, let's begin our conversation. I would like to turn to Larissa first with a general question. Why do civil society actors document serious human rights violations, and how do these documentations help with furthering legal or diplomatic efforts to end hostilities and bring perpetrators to justice?
Well, kia ora koutou everybody, and greetings from Aotearoa, New Zealand. It's an interesting question, Milena, because I think the answer to it exists on a lot of different levels, because obviously civil society exists both at a local and a national and an international level. So when we talk about what civil society can do, I think there's a real spectrum of motivations, of goals, of abilities and strengths, of where different actors within civil society can effectively document human rights violations towards criminal accountability, which is obviously the background that I come from. So I think in terms of those motivations, local and national actors have often very immediate needs for what they're doing. They're wanting to cease hostilities or reduce impacts on their local population at a very, very intense level when they're actually witnessing and suffering from violations. As you kind of move along the spectrum and you get a little bit more removed from that immediacy, then civil society's motivations change. And as they get up into the international level, then I think some of those synergies can happen. And I know PRLPG has worked quite hard on kind of bringing in the international motivations, which again range. There's often political pressures, there's awareness raising, there's international criminal accountability where people have got their eyes on a kind of a long-term prize of accountability, and the support, which is really important, of local civil society actors. And I think that's where a lot of this human rights documentation is moving towards, which is less perhaps of what we were lucky enough to do in terms of parachuting in experts, and more about empowering local actors to take control of what's actually going on in their communities. So I'd say there's a huge spectrum of the motivations and the goals, and where the synergies are best brought together is where perhaps you get the best results in terms of gathering information that can be used for accountability efforts, again, along that spectrum, locally, regionally, and internationally.
Thank you. I think you make a very important point about empowering local actors as well, and we will certainly return to this theme. Pratima, I would like to go to you next. As a former chief of investigations for the United Nations Commission on Human Rights in South Sudan, could you give us an insight into the preparatory work for documentation missions? How are these investigations planned, and typically how long do you have to prepare for them?
Sure, thank you, Elena, and it's so nice to be back with my colleagues from 2018. With respect to the documentation missions, it really depends on the nature of the investigation. So when I worked in South Sudan, the methodology was relatively consistent, but the approach the Commission took to the mandate varied from year to year, and that helped to shape the investigations undertaken and the priorities. So the first year we identified several incidents, most of them were historic incidents that our commissioners felt were emblematic of the conflict in South Sudan, and focused the investigations on those. The following year, we took more of a hybrid approach. So the Commission aimed to highlight specific thematic issues, as well as current incidents that occurred within the mandate period. The third year that I was with the Commission, we conducted documentation around several thematic standalone reports, each of which required several investigations of both historic and current events. So in parallel, the Commission was also developing several dossiers on specific individual perpetrators. So I would say that these different investigations had implications for how we approach the investigations geographically, or whether we focused on a specific time period or the range of evidence that we gathered. Sometimes you have a month to plan, and sometimes you only have a couple of days. So I've definitely been in a situation where I was in one location one day, I would return home, and then I had a day to prepare before I switched gears and traveled somewhere else. So that really means that we had to prioritize what we focused on, especially if we had limited time or resources available. Generally, when there is time, I prefer to develop very comprehensive investigation plans. These often include the history of the issue or incident that you're investigating in the background, an analysis of open source material that helps to identify a timeline of the incidents. This can include social media, national documents or records, reports by civil society organizations, other UN entities, humanitarian actors, the types of violations that occurred, and begin to identify patterns. Ideally, you'd like to interview as wide a range of individuals as possible who will be key to gather information about. And this may include an understanding of the command structure through mapping individuals, entities, or units that come up, analysis of the types of evidence or documentation you may be able to gather based on the reports of the violations you see occurring, identifying the locations where you can find victims or witnesses. And this is particularly important if people have been displaced to certain locations, refugee camps, or other settlements following an incident, or other corroborating information or evidence you may be able to gather, such as forensic evidence, satellite imagery, or other digital evidence. You also want to think about the types of questions you may be able to ask. And we also always try to build a gender perspective into each investigation. So then you want to ensure your investigation team is staffed with the relevant expertise once you identify all of these different things that you're going to be looking at. And then you develop a mission plan for each mission in support of the overall investigation. And ideally, these will map out the logistics for that mission. And it can include a security risk assessment, travel itinerary, lodging, intermediaries that you may be able to engage, interpreters, referral pathways, among other things. And then after the mission, you would ideally seek to analyze the documentation gathered, identify gaps, assess the credibility of witnesses before you go back out and try to gather more documentation.
Thank you.
Okay.
My next question is for Camille. And I wanted to just briefly talk about the trainings that somebody who is about to engage in a documentation project will receive. What do such trainings typically entail? And are there some fundamental principles that every documenter has to abide by? And how does it actually work in practice? I know that's a lot for a single question, but if you can just touch upon some of the basics here, that would be great.
Sure. For our mission, PILPG did a fantastic job training us, and not only us, but the interpreters. And then we were able to do a training together, which I think really helped us prepare for the many, many interviews that we did together. I mean, first we were trained on the methodology, which was a random sampling methodology. In practice, in theory, very simple. In practice, more complicated. You know, you choose the household, then you go to the household, and then within that household, you find potential interviewees based on if they're adults, and if they live in that home, and then you choose the person that you want to interview. And oftentimes you would have other family members say, oh, don't talk to her, you know, her brother saw most of the violence, or, you know, she doesn't know kind of the details that we want to tell you. And of course, so many people wanted to tell us their stories. And we just had to explain our methodology, and that it was a random sampling, and that even if the person we had identified hadn't seen the most, we still wanted to speak with that person. And I think after a while, and especially with our interpreters, we were able to convey that message and choose the right person based on our methodology. The other really key principle for our interviews was, even though it was a demanding schedule, allowing time for people to tell their story. We know how trauma affects the brain. It makes it difficult to give all the details when someone asks a specific question. It makes it difficult to tell events in a chronological order. And so we were aware of things like that and tried to, basically create space and time to go back to questions that maybe other questions would spur. And I think that was just really key. I mean, the types of events that people were recalling were absolutely horrific. And sometimes they hadn't even told these events to other people in their family that were listening to them tell it for the first time. And I think we all did our best to give them space to do that, and tried to avoid re-traumatization. But the reality is that's nearly impossible. You're having people recall very traumatic events. But thankfully, I think our interpreters did a fantastic job. Really, they were the ones directly speaking with our interviewees. So I give a lot of credit to them.
Thank you. The next question is for Kyle. It appears that the key here might be to allow the interviewee to freely talk about his or her experiences, but it might be challenging to translate this into legal conclusions. So how do you find grave human rights abuses, crimes against humanity, just by listening to perhaps chaotic events from people? Are there any keywords or phrases that you look for during such an interview?
Yeah, it's a really good question. First, I'll say thanks for inviting me to this panel. It's great to be on a panel with my fellow panelists who I worked with all of them, and it's great to see them again and have so much respect for everybody here. So thank you for that. But in terms of the interview itself, so my background also is accountability, essentially. So I was an international criminal prosecutor at the ICTY, at the end doing mostly Srebrenica genocide cases, so crimes against humanity and genocide. When I'm doing these interviews, whether it's in Bosnia or in Bangladesh or wherever, I'm listening for mostly patterns and perpetrators. And some of the other panelists have touched on this a little bit. So the difference between an assault and an assault that's part of a crime against humanity, or that might be a war crime, or that might be an act of genocide. It depends on the context. And it depends on the intent of the perpetrator. So in the interviews in Bangladesh, one thing, we had questionnaires that we were working with. I happen to have one that was left over. It was helpful that at the end we had to code everything. So we had a list of codes. They're broken into event codes and perpetrator codes. And this helped us to really focus on the things that were important, that we knew that were important for the people who are going to analyze these data to have. And again, it really comes down to patterns and to perpetrators. So I found in my interviews, patterns emerge really quickly. And I think in discussing, at the end of the day with the other investigators, they were seeing some of the same patterns, that, the attacks would happen at a certain time. There was always some sort of heavy military equipment involved, something more than you would think just regular police forces would have. The sort of the pattern of who was attacking and how. We saw, what we would always ask, or I would always ask at least, like what kind of uniforms were the people wearing who were perpetrating these crimes? Were they wearing any uniforms at all? What kind of weapons did they have? Who were they acting in concert with? Was it people with not in uniform, with people in uniform? Did you know these people before so you could positively identify them? And that's another pattern we saw, is oftentimes they didn't really. These were soldiers that were brought in from somewhere else. So these are the things that you're listening for. And then you ask more probing questions without hopefully re-traumatizing people, to get at some of these details. Because again, the thing we're looking at these Chappelle requirements for crimes against humanity. Was it a widespread or systematic attack? And we're looking at, was it done with a genocidal intent? So the other thing we're asking is, what did they say to you when they were doing this? Did they say anything derogatory, without being too leading? In the 45 minutes or so we had to do the interviews, really, but that's what it came down to in the Bangladesh one, is we were following, the event codes and the perpetrator codes. And that was a really good guideline, a really good basis for doing, direct, focused interviews, to determine the patterns and the perpetrators. And that helped inform the authors of the report to conclude there's reason to believe that genocide and crimes against humanity and war crimes were committed there.
Thank you. My next question goes to Stephanie, and I wanted to focus a little bit more about communication with the interviewees. I think here in the United States, we sometimes assume that the entire world speaks English, which is definitely not the case. So sometimes you're communicating with interviewees who are speaking in a different language. How do you make sure that the story of the interviewee, the information you're gathering, is translated correctly?
Sure, that's obviously one of the keys of a project like this, because you need the correct translation. And Camille touched on this a bit, and Kyle as well. You know, the interviewee process is really all about trust and doing no harm. And so you're trying to have the right investigative team, but you also need the right team around those investigators. And that really comes down to having the right interpreters. So that's a challenge with these projects, because you can't really prep your interpreter team well in advance. That's kind of something you have to do once you get on the ground. So for us in Bangladesh, that meant reaching out to contacts. UNHCR was already on the ground, a number of NGOs were on the ground, getting the names of potential interpreters. And for PILPG, it was really important to have interpreters that were trained for this mission. So the advanced team, we actually put together an interpreter training within a few days of landing on the ground with an ICC interpreter expert, Celine, who was wonderful. So we did an initial training with a big group of interpreters. And then once the investigators, the first group of investigators landed, we had multiple training sessions with an investigator and their paired interpreter. So I think it's about building the trust between the investigator and the interpreter, and making sure that when they go in as a team to somebody's home, they're on the same team. They're working together to make sure they get the information that's needed, and they do it in a way that is respectful and is in line with what the goals of the mission are. So for us, you know, I think you need interpreters that have good language skills, which was a challenge in Bangladesh because you had different dialects involved. So that was something we couldn't really test too much until we were already in the field, unfortunately. But it's a work in progress. You go, you make changes as needed. You're in constant communication with investigators and with their interpreters to make sure everybody's on the same page. You know, I don't think you're going to get the perfect translation every time. I don't think it's possible to, but I think the goal is to get the best translation that you can with interpreters that have language skills, but a fundamental understanding of what the goals of the mission are.
Thank you. My next question is a little bit different, and this one is from Sadia and has to do with the risks that documenters themselves might become exposed to. Sadia, you have spent time working in Juba, South Sudan, and you currently are in Juba, South Sudan. Have you ever been in a situation where your own well-being was endangered? And in general, how do documenters ensure that they do not become victims of human rights violations themselves?
Yes, thank you for this question, because I do think it's a really important issue to tackle, and it's not talked enough about in the investigation community. With respect to personal safety, I would like to divide my answer into two parts. First, focusing on physical safety, but then also talking about the mental health toll this work can take, because I think it's really key to talk about that. With respect to physical health, you're right. This work requires us to go to insecure locations. I have at times been a little bit scared, to answer your first question. The way to deal with this risk is through planning and preparation. Before you go in with your team, and this would be done at the level that Pratima is discussing when you start making the plans about how to tackle an investigation. You do planning, you do preparation. You have to be cognizant of the political and security context of where you're going. You have to be aware of the ways that you and your team might be identified, about how anyone seen speaking with you might be perceived. And you have to think very carefully about the actual physical locations where you might be interviewing witnesses and whether people, for example, government security agents, will be able to monitor those locations. And then, I mean, these risks exist. It's very rare that you're able to fully mitigate them. But what you have to do then is understand what those risks are beforehand and then try to put in place as many mitigation strategies as possible. Strategies need to address both your safety, the safety of your team, and this includes the safety of national colleagues and translators, because many times these are individuals who can't be evacuated with us. So we need to be very cognizant of how they're affected by what we do. And you also have to have mitigation strategies to ensure that your witnesses can't be identified. And these strategies can vary. And fortunately, there is like a breadth of people who have this kind of experience, who we're not starting from scratch when we try to figure out how to do this work. So for example, one strategy that I regularly use is not taking witness names unless they're needed. This is actually a very common practice in situations where we're not going to be directly following up on cases. And we just want a general understanding of what's happening on the ground. When we do have to take names, it's important to be very careful. I have had separate notebooks. So one notebook's I'm taking my notes, but I don't have the names, and I have like these weird codes that only I know. And then like the other notebook has names. And my handwriting is fortunately really bad, and I've like learned how to have even worse handwriting just because of my notes. Technologies, you know, when I was here in South Sudan last time, I worked with WhatsApp and Skype, but both of those are now easily breakable. So we're now using Signal, and you have to really stay on top of like what's happening with technology. Location. A few years ago, there was this horrific case of several human rights investigators who were killed while attempting to meet some supposed informers in a remote location. I am not brave. I stick to public locations. I travel with others. I have walkie-talkies. I have various types of phones with me. If my team is going, they're going to have that. And many, many people know where I am because I'm, again, not that brave, not a cowboy. For witnesses, you have to think about their safety. Again, I have met with people in the back of hair salons. I have gone through multiple public locations so I can get to a place where someone was following me. They wouldn't necessarily know who I was there to meet with. And I would say that it's really, really important when you're talking about safety to also recognize that it's hard to be objective. I work very closely with my team and my security focal points to review potential threats. On multiple occasions, I have been followed by national security agents from various countries. So for example, this happened to me when I was working on an issue in Kashmir. I have a Muslim name. I was followed even while I was doing touristy stuff, even before I started doing my work. It was very clear I was being followed, and this is a threat not only to me, but it's a threat to anyone seen with me. I can order tea, and someone might assume that the person who ordered tea for me is giving me information. So I had to, and it broke my heart, but I had to have that conversation with our security people, and I had to hand over all my research and portfolio to someone else because that was the right thing to do. There are other contexts where I've been grounded and not allowed to leave while other people were assessing the security. And again, that has to happen because it is hard to be objective when you're at the center of it. And sometimes it does mean delaying or even stopping an investigation, which, let me just be very clear, it sucks. It feels like the perpetrators are winning, but that's the call that has to be made sometimes. And one has to be creative and try to find other angles at getting at the information, but you do need to have someone on your team who's willing to say no. If you don't have that, it's dangerous. The second part of my answer, mental toll. I want to talk about this separately for two reasons. One is the toll is often cumulative, and there's often a time gap between when you're exposed to a threat and when the injury shows. But also because this is an injury that often is not talked about in a way that is helpful for us. And there's a lot of forces that actually force us to kind of feel like we have to be quiet about this. But here's the thing. Talking about working on issues of atrocities every day, it's hard. It's absolutely hard. One of the really great things about working on this investigation with PILPG was I think that I was personally very impressed at some of the safeguards that Stephanie and her team put together. And I would really love to see the UN and the INGOs that are working on this to start instituting these same practices. So some things that you have to have, for me, these are not negotiable. On staff, an available therapist who already has extensive experience with people who've faced atrocities and folks like me who work on those issues. And we were, again, very lucky that PILPG provided us with that, but that's the only time I've ever been provided that kind of support. Some organizations are increasingly starting to follow a model of having on-call therapists, but these on-call therapists are usually not at the level of training that is required for the work that we do, and there's significant room for improvement. Another thing that PILPG did that I thought was amazing was, and I've started instituting this in my own practice, is nightly or regular debriefings. These debriefings are not just about facts. I mean, here's the truth. Most of us are lawyers or investigators. We have experience documenting and can type up our notes the next day. What this was really important for was us talking to each other. It created an environment where we felt less alone, where we can express our anger, we can express our pain, and have like a place where it's kind of done together and processed through. And regular check-ins with the team just to see what support might be needed. So I think that is really key. I think it's also important for those of us who are in leadership positions or otherwise have the privilege to do so, to be open about mental health challenges, especially PTSD. We need to advocate for work environments where honest discussions about mental health does not result in a bar towards doing this work. Because the truth is the people who get the help are usually better at it and usually better at being able to support others. Personally, for me, learning to talk to my friends and family back home has also been key. I'm still not good at it. Friends and family worry. And I've held back a lot in the past thinking that I don't want to make them worry. Also, some of the work seems exotic. People don't know quite how to place that information. But honestly, for me, that backfired. I went through a particularly traumatizing experience where when I was living in Malakal, the base I was living on, the UN base was attacked. It affected me, my colleagues, the 45,000 IDPs who lived on our base. I never talked about the work that I was doing. I went back home to New York and was acting like a zombie and managed to frighten my mom and my family and my friends far more than if I'd gone and had that conversation. So it sucks, it's hard work. But one of the things that I personally really had to do was learn how to trust and lean on my friends and family. And there are real benefits to talking to people who are not in this line of work because they can sometimes offer perspective that's easily lost when doing it.
Thank you for that very honest answer. I really appreciate it. I'm sure our audience appreciates it as well. My next question is for Jay and has to do with the fact, so obviously documentation work is hard for the documenters, but it is also very, very difficult for the interviewees, the people who you're trying to find and who are willing to speak to you about some of the trauma that they have incurred or that their loved ones have gone through. I know you have experience documenting human rights abuses in North Korea. In your experience, how easy or difficult is it to find people who are willing to testify about human rights violations? How do you start? Where do you find them? And how do you go about persuading them to work with you?
Right, that's a very good question because it is extremely difficult to, for example, find North Korean refugees who are willing to talk about maybe their concentration camp experience or their drug experience, or even more difficult to find someone who witnesses, let's say, infanticide or some other really brutal, maybe torture. Like what I did about 3 times, I took I had a privilege of doing investigation on North Korean refugee or the human rights violations issues. One was the religious persecution issues. The other is the disability right issues. And 3 was the children's right issues. And then and we have about 30,000 North Korean refugees in Korea. Of course, I cannot get into North Korea, so that's the best thing we could do. And as you know, they have a different community, and it's just difficult to have just ongoing relationship with them. But that's, especially many North Koreans, they still have their relatives in North Korea. So if their identity is exposed, then their relatives, their families could be not only prosecuted, but could be prosecuted. So it's virtually impossible to, as an individual, private person, to get access to that. But thanks for me, I had incredible help from the NGO, the established NGO called the Citizens Alliance for North Korean Human Rights. And that's one of the most established North Korean human rights NGO in Korea. And they've been working on these issues from 1995. So they had a privilege of actually rescuing, or I related in rescuing, about 1,000 North Korean refugees. That's like 1,000 out of 30,000 refugees living in Korea. So they had about 20 some years of trust and the relationship. So what I did is that I formally approached the organization, and then I talked to their officers and I explained my research, and they're very discerning, and very because they want to protect the community, and they want to make sure the stories tell to the rest of the world. And especially they have experience of like helping refugee interviews, investigation on the first report on the North Korean concentration camp. So they have experience of the conducting extreme interviews. So I think the most important thing is, in this situation, you need to have a connection with a good gatekeeper. And next, through them, I explained to them, look, for example, I was doing guess what? After I got back from the Bangladesh, I actually conducted another investigation on North Korean children's rights, but not just regular children's rights. I was just curious about vulnerable children. I wanted to know what was going on in North Korean orphanages, or their prison, or maybe even in concentration camp. Do they have children? How about children, street children? Well, then challenge is, how do you find someone who has a street children experience, right? So I requested all the things, like basically these are the subtopics within CIC. So it's not something I created. So I asked them, I told them that these are the list of people I'm looking for. So can you find someone? So what they did is literally they did a search. They have a collaborating NGOs too. So they identify possible candidates on different topics. Not many. I was able to find only like 4 or 5 people who had street children experience. Maybe 3 were in institutions, etc. So then, nowadays with this consent issue and the ethical issues, so we had to contact them prior, and actually we did that. First, I think that the staff of the Citizens Alliance did it. After that, they gave us the list. Then we also had to contact to make sure that we got the consent. And then after that, we had to meet them in a mutual environment or safe environment. So often we use the office of the Citizens Alliance because often they have a different training, different humanitarian programs. They had a kind of trusting relationship. But sometimes we had to go to their home. So literally, but I think that I was very blessed in a way, because the Citizens Alliance, they assigned the staff to us. So they kind of seconded staff for us for our research. So we didn't have to build a rapport or trust, because, spend, for example, if we had to, in Bangladesh, if we had to go to the interview without interpreters or just us, then it would take a huge amount of energy and effort to build the trust, right? So in our case, this step already has an ongoing relationship with the interviewee. So we were able to ask the question. And so in that way, I think that it is very critical that, one, you need to know the community, and hopefully you find the groups who have an ongoing trusting relationship with them, and then you get their help. And 3, you also build a structure, like a lot of my colleagues says, that a good research question, and also a good But let me just tell you though, but I think that finding a victim was okay, but imagine finding a perpetrator who wants to say that I tortured let's say someone who had a Bible, or I was the one doctor who put a baby with a disability and then put upside down. Nobody wants to do that because there's a real implication. Then, being a former prosecutor, there is some criminal implication too. But of course, they are wise. They said, "Well, I heard about this, and I heard of someone in my office doing this, so that's fine." I was not, I was not doing a criminal investigation for a particular DA's office, so that was good enough. But once they felt that they were able to communicate to our team, then interesting that they also introduced some other their friends. So we are able to interview some security officers, some police officers who saw or who heard particular violations. And that's good enough for us because I was not writing up a charges or doing criminal investigation, but I was looking for a pattern or systematic action that perhaps all the things are not independent criminal action, but perhaps it is action by the government. And that's what we do, right? So, and that's what I could share. And then with North Korea. Thank you.
Thank you. My next question is for Kyle, and it has to do with the particulars of engaging in interviews and human rights documentation in the Rohingya refugee settlements. Kyle, can you tell us a little bit more about the atmosphere in the Rohingya refugee settlements and camps, and what was it like to document human rights violations there?
Yeah, I think this is one that any of my colleagues could answer pretty easily, and I think the answer might be the same. The conditions were very difficult. There are a lot of people placed in a piece of ground that was never designed to hold so many people. The conditions, the sort of open sewers, more or less. Constant fear of when the rainy season came, what would happen to all the huts that were built from bamboo and tarp, sort of built into the hillsides. It can be dusty. It could be hot. There's a lot of smoke, because people were cooking any way they could. It was very difficult. And then also, I think I was always cognizant of the fact that I'm showing up randomly, and randomly is important. Randomly at somebody's house, and asking to come in and to ask them questions about the worst thing that ever happened to them. And that these are people who had been kicked out of the place that they called home, and they were in a place that they weren't necessarily proud of being in. So it's important to try to be victim-centered when you're approaching this, although it can be very difficult. Everybody that I spoke with, I don't think I had anybody turn me down. Everybody was happy, or they seemed happy to let this random stranger into their house to ask these questions. But yeah, I mean, just the physical conditions, and then also the conditions that the people were in, understanding the things that they'd been through, and just that always weighs on you, to be cognizant and respectful of their lived life experience. And then also, you're coming into their home, and I don't necessarily know all the customs. The interpreters and fixers were really good at explaining as much as they could, but this is something that also made it quite difficult. Is, it's a different culture than mine, and I want to be completely respectful. And that was always sort of a low intensity anxiety I had with all of the interviews. But yeah, the conditions are very difficult, and they need to improve yesterday. This is what I would say about that.
Thank you. We have talked about the trauma and the mental health issues that could be caused, through this work. I'm not trying to minimize this work. Obviously, it is very important, but as Sadia told us earlier, it does take a mental toll. Stephanie, I wanted to return to this theme of translators and interpreters who are also participating in the process. As much as it's important to get the support if you're the documenter, it seems to me that it's also important that the interpreters receive adequate psychosocial support. Has that been your experience? How are interpreters prepared for these missions? And do you, as documenter, how do you make sure that the interpreters and translators are also receiving this type of support?
Yeah, I mean, in Bangladesh, I was focused on the interpreters. That was my role on the ground. And Sadia touched on this, but as a documenter, you're hearing the interviewee's story, but you're hearing it through your interpreter. They're taking that first blow, that first real emotion. And so we tried to prepare them for that. We had a psychosocial person on the ground, Sadia, helping us with it. And during the initial trainings with the interpreters, we did raise it. But I'll be the first to say I didn't do enough up front. It was a learning process for me for how to bolster the interpreters against the trauma of the work that we do. And so we had a mix of interpreters. We had some that were very experienced, had worked with other groups already on the ground, had gone into the various refugee settlements on numerous occasions. And then we had some other interpreters that were younger, didn't have the experience, but they had exceptional language skills. They were very personable. They understood the core goals of the mission and they were passionate about what they were doing. And those were the interpreters I really worried about, because this is an experience that you can't necessarily prepare for. So as much as we had investigator debriefs, I really relied on the team as a whole to kind of keep an eye on our interpreters. Was there a story that came out today that you saw your interpreter really struggle with? Is that somebody I need to pay some special attention to? So it really was a team effort, and we would have psychosocial debriefing for the interpreters as well, which wouldn't take place at the hotel where they'd meet with the investigative team. It was in their kind of home turf, so to speak. And we would kind of, as we go, determine what debriefings need to happen, what we need to talk about. But as Sadia touched on, and a lot of my colleagues did as well, for us as an investigative team, at the end of the day, we had dinner together. We could talk about what we were going through and process things naturally that way. And it was important for me to ensure that the interpreters had that same opportunity. So even if it wasn't a formal psychosocial debrief, hey, let's make sure they have dinner together sometime over the next few days. Let's make sure they have an ability, the time and the place to bond, because it's a unique experience. And as much as we're all, we want to be trained to get through these traumatic experiences and do the best that we can, we're all human. It's going to affect us. We aren't robots, and we shouldn't be in this job if we are robots. So for interpreters, it's important to bear that in mind when you're kind of working with them on the ground.
And Stephanie, while I have your attention, let me address to you one question that came through the chat. And to our audience, I'm going to do my best to weave in some of your questions over the last 12 minutes or so of our roundtable. One of the questions is, what is the benefit to conducting the interview in the language of the people you interview? You might be speaking to someone who has some knowledge of English, let's say, and they might be able to tell you what happened to them in English. So what is the benefit in conducting the interview in their own language, in your experience?
So two things. One, I think it's a level of comfort. The interviewee may know some English, but you're asking them to tell you about the worst experience they've gone through. Make it easier for them as much as you can. Let them speak to you in their native language. And two, one of the issues we dealt with in Bangladesh is there were different names for villages and cities, and there were different names whether you were asking in Bengali or you had a Rohingya refugee explaining the situation. And so for just documentation purposes to get the information, it was better for us to have the situation and the details explained in the interviewee's native dialect, because we could track that back. If we instead conducted the interviews in English as much as possible, we'd lose some of those nuances and some of those details that I think we really needed.
Yes, thank you. I absolutely agree with that. And just to add to this, from having read a lot about, for example, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, my understanding is that, for example, in one of the local languages, there were several words that could be translated as rape in English. So when you're documenting or later on prosecuting, it is so important to be able to get the nuance, to be able to understand what actually happened. My next question is for Pratima. From your experience as an investigator in these, different places, is there anything in particular that has struck you as, something, for example, that you think tends to cause more trauma for the victims, particular types of questions that might re-traumatize the victims, anything that sticks in your mind as having caused trauma, being very, very difficult for perhaps both the documenter and the victim?
Thank you so much, Melina. I think, especially if it's a victim or a witness that you haven't engaged with before, it's sometimes very difficult to know what might trigger somebody. And so you really have to be attuned on a very emotional level when you're conducting the interview to try to see whether or not you have any signals. One thing that I've seen working with different populations is really high levels of trauma and generational trauma that may pass from one generation of a family to a next. And then also the cultural or other social constraints to the expression of that trauma. And so as we've discussed, a lot of the populations that I've worked with are living in very harsh humanitarian circumstances and are experiencing repeated violations and displacement over the span of their life. In South Sudan, especially men that I would meet would tell me about their lives, starting their lives as refugees or child soldiers during the war with Sudan, and then their experiences with loss again during the conflict in South Sudan. And I think we see a similar dynamic with the Rohingya communities who've experienced persecution in a variety of ways, including through lack of citizenship across other generations and the implications that this has for other fundamental rights, and the way that people internalize these forms of repression. And then this is compounded by lack of adequate medical care, including mental health and psychosocial support services. Especially in the context that I've worked in, and this also includes interviewing and representing people in or refugees in the migrant camps in Greece. Forced witnessing of sexual acts or killing or other harm to family members featured pretty prominently. Separation from children or other family members also caused a great deal of trauma. I remember interviewing a mother who managed to tell me about all of the other relatives that she had who had been killed, but she never mentioned that her own child had died in her arms due to hunger until the very end of an interview. And that came about, once she felt a bit more comfortable with me as somebody meeting her for the first time. One thing I've also seen is that in cases of detention and torture, which I've worked on a great deal, there were also high levels of trauma that sometimes doesn't garner the level of attention that it should, or the resources, because many of the victims and survivors tend to be men. And this often overlaps with cases of sexual violence that occur in detention. And sexual violence generally, especially in South Sudan, in the Rohingya context, it did come up. And I think we were really fortunate that we had Sadia with our team. And I'm fortunate because I still do work with her on some level with our team. This is something that's provided with our organization. But I really think that understanding that there are these different dynamics at play, it's really something that we should give more attention to.
Thank you. My next question is for Larissa along the same lines. Larissa, I know you participated in the investigation in Darfur and you contributed with your investigation to a book called Genocide in Darfur, Investigating the Atrocities in Sudan. Can you add anything to Pratima's observations regarding trauma that the victims experience after human rights abuses? And are there any specific interviews, points in time that have touched you during this mission? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. No, I really reflect back on what Pratima says there, and particularly if I recall an interview I did in Chad with the Darfurian community in terms of detention, where I interviewed a young man who was extremely detailed. He had an excellent memory. He was able to recall all of the events of the attack, and then he was arrested and detained for some time. And in contrast to the detail he provided in the attack, his description of the detention was very vague. And although he recorded the beatings that other people had experienced, he maintained that nothing had happened to him. But his demeanor during the interview was interesting. He was very conscious of people around him. As soon as anybody came near, he stopped talking. And I just got that sense that there's more that he wanted to say, but he wouldn't. And so we made sure that he understood the role of what we were doing and why we were collecting this information. And we gave him the opportunity to add anything at the end, and he didn't, and that was fine. We took what we had. But what I obviously recall about this is that some hours later he found me in the camp. He must have been wandering around because they're enormous, and maybe I'm probably a little bit identifiable there, but all the same he tracked me down and he said, there's two things I've got to tell you. The first, he clarified about the aircraft that had been involved in the attack, because he'd been kind of cogitating about what it was and he'd told me the wrong thing. And then he also looked around and looked at my interpreter, who was a man, and said, in detention, I suffered from a man's beating. And from that disclosure, it was clear that he had been the victim of a sexual assault of some kind. And he had been thinking about that. And I just have so much respect for the shame, the embarrassment, the trauma that he was undergoing. But he had, in some way, and maybe I'm reflecting incorrectly on his own experience, but decided that it was necessary for him to have that recorded in what we were doing. And I think the other thing that I'd just touch on is, certainly in the Rohingya experience, I was particularly struck by stories where family members had physically rescued other family members or friends who were injured and had gone to heroic efforts to carry people over large distances, and they were telling these stories in a way that was extremely emotional for them and for me. I found it very, very moving. But what it also revealed, I think, was an aspect of survivor's guilt, because there were also stories of people who they couldn't help and who they had seen injured and had to leave behind, or seen on the way who were dying, and there was nothing they could do. And as appalling as the conditions were that we were interviewing people in, they had made it to safety. And I think that's part of the trauma that these communities live with, is that concept of survivor guilt and how they have managed to escape where others that they loved did not.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we are very quickly running out of time. I would like to give each of our panelists the opportunity to give a closing statement, with the caveat that the closing statement truly can not be longer than 15 seconds. So let me, Sadia, would you like to go first?
Sure. I would say that it's weird being in a position where you have to gather people's stories and give voice to them. That's an enormous responsibility, and you're being given this responsibility not because people lack a voice, but because we live in structures where our voices ring louder. To me, that means a couple of things. One of those things means that we need to engage this work with great humility. We have to be very careful about how we use these stories, make sure that they don't fall into racist and other tropes of two-dimensional poor peoples out there. We need to be more careful. And as Camille mentioned before, we have to take whatever opportunities we can to actually allow people to tell their own stories when we're in a position to be able to do that. And just real quickly, it's an enormous responsibility that's also a burden. It's hard to do, especially when you feel like you're seeing all of these horrible atrocities and then you come home and it's not even newsworthy. It's hard. but there's worth in bearing witness. There's worth in documentation. Facts matter. What actually happened mattered, even if it might not matter for a while. We have to believe that it matters and do the work anyway.
Camille, would you like to go next?
Sure. I would just say that we know there's so much more investigation and documentation to be done. And I hope that the Rohingya voices are centered in the way that, whatever potential justice initiatives move forward, that they have a voice in what's going to be done and how it's done.
Thank you. Jay?
I just want to, just good to be back. And one thing about this investigation we did together was we had a great team. And thanks for all this people, diversity. I represent the 10 billion people of East Asia and all this. And that really keep us to check and balance any bias and impartiality, which I had, but I learned so much. And Kyle, I'm actually baking a bread thanks to you, and it changed my life. And Camille, I bought my yoga mat, but I'm still reading YouTube how to do it. And Sadia, that was last sunglasses. I'm not sure whether I'm good looking sunglasses. Fatima, thanks for being my career advisor. And Larissa, you're just amazing. She was in my small team, and they made us compete. They like 10 interviews a day, 1,000. They're putting numbers, but thanks for keeping me sane. And you are the one who kept up. You took all the great photos, and then of course Stephanie. And thanks for the great. I had an incredible experience with my interpreter. They're the best team. And I miss you all. And where is Steve? He would bring it on a dimension. But thank you, Professor. Appreciate it. So on a serious note, the victims need a voice. They need a justice, and also they need to be members. So we need to do this. Thank you.
Thank you, Kyle.
Yeah, I'm just echoing what everybody else has said. There were so many times when I talked to somebody in the camps and they expressed astonishment. Like, why are you talking to us? These are people whose voices hadn't been heard, and nobody cared to hear their voices in the place that they called home, that was their home. They were astonished that anybody would come and want to hear what they had to say about things that happened, because normally the people who would be interested in whose responsibility it was to take those stories were the ones who were perpetrating the crimes against them. So that's why, to me, that's the takeaway, is that's how important these sorts of missions are, and this work is. And I'm very honored to have been a part of this.
Thank you. Pratima?
Thank you, Milena. One thing that I would just add, and I think Larissa touched on this in the very beginning, is that documentation can serve many different purposes. And so you can document for accountability, but it can also serve a critical role in truth-telling and memorialization. It can help to inform reparations, other institutional reform. And so even if it doesn't meet the legal threshold for admissibility, it's still very important for building a historical record of what occurred, identifying appropriate remedies, and preventing violations from recurring again in the future. And this is something that we work with the Rohingya on, and ensure that they're also the ones doing the documentation and deciding what their needs and priorities are in all of this.
Thank you. Stephanie?
I think that this line of work is, you can prepare as much as you want to, but there's really nothing like experience on the ground. And so you can hear with everyone today, we have a special bond because of what we went through together. And so if you're looking to get into this line of work, if this is really what you want to do, listen to the people around you, be a sponge. I learned so much on the ground in Bangladesh, just listening to investigators around the dinner table at night. So I think that serves you well in this line of work, is you will never be perfect. You will never know everything. You are always learning from the interviewees and from the investigators.
Thank you. And Larissa, you have the last word.
Oh, geez, that's a lot of responsibility. I would just reflect a little bit on kind of the arc of justice, really, because it is often slow, and often these efforts appear futile because the results outside of awareness raising and memorialization, and even things like memorialization, can take decades to come to fruition. But a bit like democracy, it's kind of the best system that we've got at the moment. So being a part of this is always a privilege. And I think this group, amazing group of people, and everybody who works in this field around the world for contributing to that arc of justice in terms of our attempts to rid the world of human rights violations.
Thank you so much. We're out of time for today. Thank you for joining us and submitting your questions, and apologies that we were not able to get to all of the questions. The webinar recording will be available on the PILPG website and also shared with the attendees via email. I would like to reiterate that this event was part of the PILPG Thought Leadership Initiative Expert Roundtable series. We organize monthly expert roundtables and share our expertise and insights on various international law and international affairs topics. Thank you again to our panelists for sharing their stories, and to all the attendees for contributing to this fascinating discussion with questions. And I encourage everyone to follow our Thought Leadership Initiative and join us for the next event in March. Thank you.